Hey y'all, welcome back to another one of my Vue videos, and in this video, I want to show you guys how to make this file drop component. This could be useful if you want to add a function or feature that allows users to drag files and upload them from their computer to your web app. But this is also really useful if you just want to create some draggable elements on your application. For example, something like Trello where you drag the cards to different boards and stuff like that. Because I'm going to be focusing on the functionality of the drag and drop as opposed to the stylistic elements of the component. Just because, the stylistic parts, that's going to look really different for whatever app you're using, but the feature sets are really similar and you're going to need to know the different events that we're going to cover today. So first, let's look into the drag and drop API. If you've watched a previous video on events in Vue, you'll know that browsers have a lot of built-in functionalities that we as developers can use. The drag and drop feature set is one of these functionalities, and it's really well documented on sites like MDN. The browser provides a lot of different events that we can listen to know when things are being dragged, and as well as accessing a lot of the metadata around these drag events. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the concept of events, I highly recommend learning about that first, and I'll link my video on events in Vue in the top right corner. So looking here, we have a diagram, just as found on a random, Chinese, looks like a developer blog, link here. You can, so all the credit to this blog. But this diagram shows a lot of the different events that we have with drag and dropping. So there's different events that indicate, when the drag starts, when the drag is entering a specific element. Like you see here, when we drag something into an element, there's a drag enter event that's emitted. Drag over, for example, is emitted constantly as you're dragging an element across another element. So for example, if I'm dragging something over this div, every 200 to 300 milliseconds, a drag over event will be emitted. And drag leave, pretty self-explanatory. When you're dragging something off of this element, it's going to emit a drag leave. And then of course drop, when you finally drop an element onto another element. And so if none of that really made sense, let's go over to a simple HTML example to show you 3 of these events in action. So here I just have a little snippet of code. And as you can see, it's just a super simple div. You can see the square here. And I have 3 different event handlers on this div. So the first one is the drop handler, and then a drag over, and a drag leave. These 3 events are important because they can capture a complete life cycle of a drag and drop. Pretty much all the scenarios, right? You can drag an element onto it, off of it, or drop the element in there. So let's quickly look at these 3 handlers, right? The drop handler, when something is dropped onto the square, what should happen is the square will turn red for 1500 milliseconds, so 1.5 seconds, and then it'll turn back white. Drag over, so when an element is being dragged over this square, it'll turn green, and when the element is dragged off of it, it will turn back white. Let's just quickly demonstrate that using, these are some pictures of my dog, and let's see, when we drag the element over, right, it turns green, off, white, and then onto it is green. Notice it's based on the cursor. And if I drop this in here, it'll turn red. And so hopefully that's really simple visual example of these elements in action. And really quickly before we move on, you might notice that I have .prevent on all of these events. And the reason for that is, if you remember from the video on events, you'll know that browsers, for certain events, they have default built-in ways of handling them. Like for example, when you right-click, the browser's context menu will pop up. And so when you drag a file onto the browser, the default behavior is actually to open that file when you drop it. And let's look here. So when I drop this file onto just the general space of the web page, it opens the file. And so, generally that's not what you want to happen. So we're just going to use .prevent to ensure that behavior does not occur and that we're using custom handlers to handle all that behavior. So now that we know which events to listen to, the next step is logically accessing the file that was dropped. Here we need to turn to the documentation again. We want to look at the documentation for a drag event, which is essentially the interface that encompasses the entire drag and drop lifecycle. And so all the event types that we looked at that occur across a drag and drop lifecycle, they all use the drag event interface. And so that means for all of these events, each of the events that's emitted has a property called data transfer. And data transfer if we click into the data transfer object documentation, see that has a lot of interesting properties. For us, the most obvious one is data transfer dot files. And so as it says here, it contains all of the local, meaning the files on the computer, local files available on the data transfer. So when you drag and drop a file from your computer onto the browser, you can access those files by calling the event.datatransfer.files. So coming back into our code, there are a few things we need to do in order to access this event and the data transfer object in it. First, we need to pass the actual event into the handler so we can access it. In Vue, for all these captured events, the way to explicitly pass in the event is to use this $event variable. And so what this means is just whenever this type of event is emitted, you can pass the actual event object using this variable into the handler. And so we also need to define it in our handler as well. And so we can just call it event. I'm going to use type any just for ease. This is not the best practice for TypeScript. As we saw in the documentation, a way we can access the files is, let's call this dropped files, is by accessing the event.datatransfer.files property. And the reason why it's files is that you can actually drag anywhere from 1 to I think 100 files at once. So there could be multiple files being dragged at once. Now, next I'm going to create just an array to hold all of the files that were dropped. So if you drop multiple times, you're maintaining all of your files. And I'm just going to make this an array. And when we have these drop files, I'm going to iterate over each file and push into this .all files. So that'll push all the dropped files into our stored array. And so just to give us a visual, some visual feedback about how this is working, let's put some HTML code here. I'm just going to use a p element and iterate over every file in our array. And I'm just going to display the file .name. And so this is also something you can find in the MDN docs, but the browser will actually give us some metadata about the files that we have access to, and including things like .name, .size, last edited, things like that. So here we're just going to use the name, and then we should be able to see that when we drag some files, you can see that the names are being appended here. For example, if we drag all 6 of these, it pushes all 6 of these files into this array, and we can see the names. So now I'm going to cut to this slightly more fleshed out version of the component. And again, I just want to emphasize that we're not going to focus too much on the the visual aspects of this component. And so there's going to be a lot of code that I wrote, but a lot of it is just going to be aesthetic. It's going to be styling this element, centering things, flex boxes. So I'm not going to cover it too much, but I don't want you to feel like I've just glossed over a bunch of code. There are a few main features that I want to talk about and highlight though. So just to show you, this is largely the same component. We can drop files here and they'll show up underneath here. We just added this little trash can icon to let you delete the things out of the array. And looking at the code, here we have the part that displays the files. We added some custom classes to display those neat rows for each file, as well as the trash can icon. We still have pretty much the same drop handler. It just doesn't change the color of the box like before. And these two handlers are unchanged, but I'm going to change that. I'll show y'all how I'm going to change that. Down here, we just have this is a lot of the CSS part, and I don't want you to get too bogged down by this. And like I said, a lot of it is just adding, borders and flex and alignments and stuff like that. So it's really not too crazy down there. And so the part that I wanted to show y'all is how to make your element respond when someone is dragging an element over your drop zone, for example. So you might be familiar with this if you've interacted with other websites. When you drag a file onto their drop zone, oftentimes there's some sort of response or reaction, just to indicate to the user that yes, you can drop your file here and it will be received. We can use the drag over and the drag leave events to help us do that. So I'm going to delete these two handlers first, and I already commented it out, but I'm going to delete these down here. And I want to create a new handler called setIsDragOver. And what I'm going to do is just create a variable called isDragOver. and I'm going to set it to false at first. It's just a Boolean. And set is drag over is going to take in a Boolean, and we're going to just set this dot is drag over equals to the new is drag over value. So it just takes in a Boolean true or false. And what is drag over is going to indicate is whether or not our element is currently being dragged over, right? Simple enough. Whenever we are dragging over, we want to set is drag over probably to true. And whenever we leave the element, we're going to set is drag over to false. So what this will do is it'll give us a Boolean that essentially lets us know, is something being dragged over this element right now or not. The way that's useful is we can style conditionally based on this Boolean. So if something is being dragged over, we can set specific CSS class, and if it's false, then we can take away that CSS class. And the way to do that in Vue is we have this thing called conditional class binding. So what this means is you can write the name of a CSS class here in using this kind of dictionary format, and then you can define, it's like a key value format, right? So the key is the name of the CSS class, and then the value is a Boolean value in JavaScript. And you can write, so let's just set it to our Boolean is drag over. So what this means is when is drag over is true, this CSS class will be applied, but if it's false, then this class will not be applied. And so you notice this is using the Vue binding syntax. If we just use the normal class syntax, this is what it would look like, and it would just statically apply this class all the time. No conditional binding. So hopefully that's kind of makes sense. So let's make a CSS class called FileDropBox DragOver. And what we can do is down here, we have FileDropBox class, right, which is the normal default styling. Let's define the responsive class. So we'll just define FileDropBox DragOver, and let's just do something simple, So let's say when we are dragging over the box, let's make the background and the border darker, for example. So right now, by default, it's gray 200 background. So let's just say when we drag over, make it background gray 400, and the border is default 500. So we'll make the border gray 700 when we drag over. By the way, these are just Tailwind CSS classes that control the number is just indicating the shade of the color. So 400 and 700 are darker colors than 200 and 500. If we look at the site and we try to drag a file over, you can see that when we drag over it, it just changes the style slightly, and when we move it off, it returns back to normal. Let's look at what happens when we drop it. You can see that the div turned darker gray, but it didn't turn back. And so when we drag a file over the div and then drop it, there's actually no drag leave event that occurs. And so what we need to do is handle that in the drop handler to set is drag over false. So we can do that really quick here in drop handler. Set is drag over is false, because when you drop something, right, the drag is over. And so that's just a really simple design principle using the drag over effect is you can dynamically style your elements using some type of is drag over Boolean, and then just setting that Boolean using the event handlers. So I just wanted to share that quick tip with y'all as you create your drag and drop elements. And so that's about it for this video. Thank you so much for tuning in, and as usual, if you enjoy this type of content, please be sure to like and subscribe to support my channel, and stay tuned for future content. So thanks y'all, and I'll see y'all next time.